Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to kick off this conference with some of my favorite friends and colleagues. Before we begin our conversation today, and I promise you it will be a conversation, we'll have lots of time for Q&A, which Trillium will moderate for us. I want to show you a short video that I think suggests one of the significant challenges of our era in teaching and learning. So can we see that first video, please? I like to begin keynotes with that film because I think it raises some very profound questions. As you know, the theme of this conference this year is engaged learners. But I think the prior questions we need to ask is, engage them for what in preparation for what? The world is being profoundly disrupted. Artificial intelligence, the taking of jobs is only being accelerated by COVID. And so I think the most fundamental question we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that we human beings can uniquely do that computers cannot do? And how do we best prepare young people for this new world and to develop their fullest capabilities? You know, I began teaching in 1971, high school English teacher. And at the time, it was the twilight of the industrial era. And people were talking about the new knowledge economy and the need for knowledge workers. Well, you know, Peter Drucker coined that term in 1969, 50 years ago. A lot of people still think we have a knowledge economy, but I believe that's mistaken. We live in the innovation era. What's the difference? Knowledge has now become a commodity, growing exponentially, changing constantly, worth only as much as your capability of making sense of that knowledge. In fact, the world really no longer cares how much our graduates know. What the world cares about is what they can do with what they know, which is a brand new and completely different education problem. And it has profound implications for the employability of this next generation. Let me give you a couple of examples. You know, Google used to only hire kids from Ivy League colleges and only interview those who had the highest test scores and GPAs. Well, along comes Laszlo Bock, Senior VP of People Operations at the time, analyzes the data and discovers that all of the indices they had been using for hiring and promotion were, quote, worthless, unquote, his words. He went on to say the skills you need to succeed in a competitive academic environment bear no relationship to the skills you need to succeed in the innovation economy. So what has Google done? They stopped asking for your college degree. They stopped asking for the transcript. They stopped asking for test scores. 15% of Google's new hires now don't have a BA degree at all. And that trend is growing dramatically among corporations and businesses, both large and small. Another example, I was in Ho Chi Minh City a few years ago at the invitation of Deloitte, the accounting and consulting firm, and had lunch with the CEO who knew of my prior affiliation to Harvard and affiliated at the time. And she said, with a kind of a wry smile, she said, you know, we used to hire the best students from the best universities, but we don't do that anymore because it turns out they don't work out so well. She said, now we look for good students, but we put them through a summer-long boot camp to see how they solve problems collaboratively. And then we decide whether or not to offer them a job. So the question to me is, how do we best prepare young people for the innovation era? First, let's get clear about what is innovation and what I think we can and cannot do. When I researched this for my book, Creating Innovators, which was published in 2012, the first thing I came to learn is that there are really two very different kinds of innovation. One is about bringing new possibilities to life. Think of Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. I don't believe you can educate someone to be one of those folks. In fact, all three of them were college dropouts. But there's another kind of innovation every bit as important, and that is to be a creative problem solver. And increasingly, I'm finding around the world, whether it's in health or in education or in government or in nonprofits and for-profits, the capacity to solve problems creatively is the coin of realm. Now, here's the good news. We are born curious, creative, imaginative. That is the human DNA. The average 5-year-old asks 100 questions a day. And I'm reminded of that because I now have 4 grandchildren. And those kids also think of themselves as artists, all of them. They love to draw and color. But then something happens. We call it school, because you see, the longer kids are in school, the fewer questions they ask, the more they become obsessed with getting the right answers. And fewer and fewer and fewer think of themselves as creative in any way. So what must we do differently? Well, that's a question I posed to a number of young people initially in interviews, all of whom had been recognized as creative problem solvers. I wanted to know what was different about their background, about their parenting, about their schooling. So I did extensive interviews. I interviewed an equal number of young men and young women. I interviewed some from privilege, some from poverty, some who had just recently immigrated to the US, and others of whom had been here for many generations. And later I extended those interviews beyond to young people in many other countries. And obviously one of the first questions that I was most interested in was about their education. Well, that was the first troubling finding. You see, some of these kids had gone to what are supposed to be leading universities, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, to be specific. And they all told me they had become successful creative problem solvers in spite of their schooling, not because of it. But I persisted. I said, hasn't there been at least one teacher who's made a difference for you? And they could all name at least one. Not rarely more than a couple, but at least one. And the grade range of those teachers was kindergarten to graduate school. So I went and interviewed all of those teachers to see if I could see some kind of pattern of their teaching. And the interesting thing that I learned was they were all outliers in their system, teaching in ways that were fundamentally different than their peers, yet remarkably similar to one another. Then I spent time interviewing and observing in those few schools and colleges that in fact really do teach creative problem solving and are known for it. I went to the MIT Media Lab. I went to the then new Olin College of Engineering. I went to the D School at Stanford. I went to, High Tech High, New Tech High, Envisions, Expeditionary Learning. And way back at the youngest ages, I went to visit Montessori schools and Reggio Emilia schools. And the pattern from Reggio Emilia to MIT's Media Lab, the pattern of teaching and learning was stunningly similar and very similar to how my outlier teachers were also teaching. So out of this, what I came to understand is that there's a very dramatic difference between the kinds of teaching and learning that still dominate the world, which is a product of the industrial era. It's kind of a conveyor belt, assembly line approach. And the kind of teaching and learning that I saw that prepared young people to be successful creative problem solvers. 5 contradictions I'm going to briefly talk about. Contradiction number 1, conventional schooling is all about celebrating, rewarding, and measuring individual achievement. Well, certainly there's a place for that. But all of these teachers and all of these organizations emphasized teamwork because they know that's what adults have to do. Accountable teamwork, not this group work where one kid does all the work. Accountable teamwork where kids evaluated one another's contributions to the team and work accountable to the team. Contradiction number 2 are the ways in which we compartmentalize knowledge and silo subject content according to a scheme that was really born at the dawn of the 20th century called Carnegie units. Well, it turns out that innovation is not only a team sport, innovation demands a multidisciplinary approach to problem solving. As someone at Google told me, said, you cannot solve a single problem with just one academic discipline. Knowing this, these teachers in these more innovative schools designed interdisciplinary courses where teams worked on real problems or big questions. Contradiction number 3 is about the culture of the classroom. The culture of the classroom in conventional schools so often is a culture of compliance. It's a culture of passivity, of consumption. The culture of the innovation-driven classrooms is radically different. It's a culture where students are expected to question received wisdom, expected to question authority, where they're expected to take initiative, and where the teacher sees his or her role not as so much the expert, the sage on stage, but rather as a performance coach and a mentor, coaching students to higher performance standards. Contradictions 4 and 5, I think, are the most challenging of all for us. You see, contradiction 4 is all about the F word in schools. Failure, worst thing that can happen. How do you fail? Well, you make more mistakes than the person next to you. We create a bell curve based on how many errors or mistakes people have made. The lower your grade, the more mistakes you make. Well, here's the problem. Not only does that create extraordinary stress and increasing levels of anxiety among our young people, but it also is in total contradiction to the innovation era. Innovation demands that you take risks, that you make mistakes, and that you fail. I went to IDEO, the most innovative design company in the world. Turns out the company motto is fail early, fail often. Imagine if that was our motto in schools. You know, other companies talk about fail fast, fail forward, fail cheap, fail smart, but fail. Now, obviously, they're not talking about failing in quite an academic sense. What they're talking about is the methodology of innovation, which at its heart is trial and error, going from 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0, learning from mistakes, applying what you've learned. Now, not only is this kind of at the heart of the world of innovation, I think it's at the heart of all learning. How do infants learn to speak or to walk? Trial and error. Well, what would happen if we said to a young person learning to walk, I'm sorry, no crawling, that's not allowed. You can only walk until you can stand up and walk in a straight line, and no gibberish. We want complete sentences that are grammatically correct. I'm bicycle riding, completely out of the question, because we know you're going to fall on skinny. No. If I were live with you this morning and could see your faces, I would ask you one simple question: to raise your hand if you've learned more from your mistakes than your successes. Well, I can certainly count myself as that. I recently wrote a memoir called Learning by Heart, an Unconventional Education, and it's much more a chronicle of all the mistakes I made and what I learned from them than it is so much a record of my successes. It's brutally honest, too. So, back to contradiction 4 for a minute. What's the alternative to the bell curve? Well, increasingly, I've come to believe the alternative to the bell curve is a mastery-based learning system. What does that mean? That means that you work towards a level of proficiency that has been clearly identified, and you get a credit, or think of it as a scouting badge, once you've reached that level of proficiency. I actually did that in many of my classes. The only 3 grades that were available in my classes were A, B, or incomplete. The only F I acknowledged was the failure not to show up, not to try at all. I considered a student's work to be incomplete until they'd reached this level of proficiency. How did I know they were proficient? I, back then, had every student keep a paper portfolio, and I would conference with them regularly, collect their portfolios, and I saw, of course, their demonstrations of mastery in their oral work in the classroom. Rarely do we see someone whose work is outstanding, who's excellent, clearly superior. That's what I think an A should be for. You know, that is, in fact, how the adult world works. How do you become a plumber? How do you become an electrician? How do you get your driver's license? You show proficiency. And you don't get that license until you have reached a level of proficiency. I mean, really, do you want to fly with a C- airline pilot? You know, a pilot who's gotten pretty good on the takeoffs, but hasn't figured out this landing thing? That's not how the adult world works. Why then should school be any different? The damage we're doing in trying to artificially rank kids by how quick and clever some are, when in fact, if we give kids more time and support, they can all or nearly all reach proficiency. To me, that's the alternative. A high school diploma should be a certificate of mastery. And in fact, I serve on the board of something called the Mastery Transcript Consortium, mastery.org. And it's a collection of 330 high schools from around the world, both public and independent, that are developing exactly this, a mastery-based transcript, and engaging with colleges and universities to make this a new and very different kind of way of capturing what students can really do and who they really are And it's critical that we do this, particularly now in the time of COVID. And we have this great crack in the cosmic egg where many, many colleges, 1,600 at last count, don't any longer require test scores. So I think this is a huge opportunity for innovation. And I urge you to look at Mastery Transcript Consortium. So to the last contradiction, and that is the contradiction around motivation. How do we motivate kids in school? Well, all too often, with the exception of the rare teacher or the rare class, we motivate kids through carrots and sticks. It goes right back to grading, rewards and punishments, extrinsic incentives. But what I've come to learn is that innovation and the most successful innovators and creative problem solvers are far more intrinsically motivated. They do their best work when it's work worth doing. They seek jobs where they can make a difference. So I wanted to try to understand where had that come from? What did it kind of strengthen that in these young people? So as I mentioned earlier, I interviewed all of their parents and teachers as well. And I went back and went through the research. I discovered a pattern. Both parents and teachers of these successful young problem solvers had explicitly encouraged three things: play, passion, and purpose. Parents encouraged exploratory play, more time outside, fewer toys, less screen time, toys without batteries. Teachers created a space for what I call disciplined play in their classes, where kids could explore new possibilities, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. As these kids grew older, the parents were encouraging them to constantly explore new interests, new ideas, new possibilities, in the hopes that they would discover a real interest that might evolve into a passion. These parents understood that to develop what is Angela Duckworth calls grit, perseverance, tenacity, all of these things that we know are critical for adult success. How do you do that? We know that they're important, but how do you do it? I think from the research I've done, it's very clear. These parents believe that the best way for these young people to develop the grit, the perseverance, the tenacity was to pursue a real interest that would become a passion. And teachers also made time in their classes for young people to pursue real interests in these innovation-driven schools and classrooms. But passion morphs, it evolves. It's not enough. But in every case with the young people whom I have interviewed now, and there are many dozens, that passion evolves into a deeper sense of purpose, a desire to give back and to make a difference. We all know this because teaching is as much a calling as it is a profession. Many of us were drawn to teaching to also make a difference. And these parents and teachers had made that very explicit. They had sort of created a moral foundation, not necessarily religious-based, but with the idea that we are not here simply on this earth to serve ourselves. We have some responsibility to give back and make a difference. And that's what most motivated all of these young innovators whom I interviewed and profiled. So let me conclude before we have some Q&A about things you might want to consider and do back in your schools. I think the first most important thing is to imagine a diploma, whether it's a college diploma, a high school diploma, a middle school diploma, even an elementary diploma, as a certificate of mastery. Today, what do these diplomas stand for? All of them. They are certificates of seat time served. How much time did you spend? That's what we call credit hours or Carnegie units. And a grade is merely an indication of how well you've served your seat time. It is not in any way a certificate of proficiency, a certificate of mastery. So I deeply believe we have to reconfigure how we think about diplomas. And that requires us to sit down together and research and understand the content knowledge, the skills, and the dispositions that matter most. We can't set proficiency standards until we're clear about proficient at what. To be very, very clear, I believe academic content knowledge still matters for lots of reasons, and I'm sure I don't have to convince you of that. But in the 21st century, because knowledge has become a commodity and can be looked up anywhere, skills matter more. Skills of critical thinking, being able to ask really good questions is at the heart of creative problem solving. Collaboration is critical. Communication, of course, and creative problem solving. So we have to define the skills and also the dispositions. Academic content knowledge matters, skills matter more, motivation matters most. So we have to do the hard, challenging work of defining what a graduate should know and be able to do. EdLeader 21 has some great tools for that, for creating a profile of a graduate. That's edleader21.org. Then the harder part comes in assessment. See, it does very little good if we create a profile of a graduate with, grandiose aspirations, but don't tie assessments to them. So I think we're going to have to think long and hard about not being so data-driven, but more evidence-based. A test is a snapshot in time. Doesn't tell you a lot. A digital portfolio, on the other hand, where you see a progressive record of a young person's developing mastery, I believe should be the basis for all of the assessment. Collective human judgment, collective, not individual, informed by evidence, I think will ultimately be the absolute best way we can assess student work. And that requires us to kind of rethink and reimagine how we work together. It can't be an individual human judgment. That's often too capricious. It has to be collective. So then I think the next opportunity, once we think about assessment and digital portfolios, by the way, are at the heart of the Mastery Transcripts Consortium's new transcript. Then I think the question is, how do we incent or encourage innovations in school? Top-down change simply doesn't work. That creates compliance. We know that. So it has to be a combination of some top-down initiatives with bottom-up initiatives. And one of the things that I have proposed and that some schools have done is create an innovation fund to which teams of teachers can apply. Why teams? Teams will iterate more quickly, they'll take more responsible risks than will individuals. Teams of teachers creating new interdisciplinary courses. Teams of teachers creating better end of semester assessments, or even, as you'll see in the video in just a moment, opportunities where students can present and defend their work to adults. These are the kinds of innovations that I think are critically needed and cannot be mandated. So if you're a teacher right now and saying, all right, I can't do all of that right now. I'm just a teacher. What can I do this minute? I would like to offer two proposals. First is encourage your students to keep a question journal. Curiosity, I am learning, is at the very heart of innovation. All of the innovators whom I've met have one thing in common. They're all curious. And sadly, I think the longer kids are in school, the less curious they appear, or perhaps have even, their curiosity is withered. So curiosity begins with being more intentional and conscious about your questions, your concerns, and for us as adults as well. And then give kids a little bit of time to actually research the questions that interest them or explore a new interest. You know, you call it Google time, whatever you want to call it. Maybe it's 5% of the curriculum, 10% initially, but it's a starting point. And my friend Ted Dintersmith has done a wonderful new website called whatschoolcanbe.org, What School Can Be, which is the title of his terrific book, where he documents all these kind of things as ways of starting, of creating sparks in your school. So these are some of the things that I believe we can do and that are being done in schools all over the country. But let me end this part of my talk by giving you a little glimpse of what it actually looks like in a classroom. High Tech High is a network of charter schools, K-12 in San Diego, with its own graduate school of education. And it's very different than other charter schools. Students are selected by lottery and by zip code at High Tech High. They're not, just plucked out. So what that means is that the student population there is broadly representative of the population of San Diego, predominantly minority, about half the kids on free and reduced lunch. Now, this is a school that has very different priorities. There are no varsity sports, no big gyms, no playing fields. All their money goes into the classroom. There's intramural sports, of course. Another difference is that all classes, virtually all, are team taught. And Larry Rosenstock, the founder of High Tech High, who's since retired, told me a long time ago that, of all the innovations that he put into the school, the importance of team teaching was critical because teaching becomes transparent. And in fact, in their buildings, there is always at least one glass wall in every classroom. The expectation is people are going to help each other improve. So we're going to see a very quick video from our film, Most Likely to Succeed. If you haven't seen that film, that's a great starting point for community-based conversations, Most Likely to Succeed. It's on all of the streaming platforms. We're going to see a 5-minute clip of a 9th grade class. 9th grade class taught by 2 teachers, one who's humanities, history and English, and one who's science and math, and a little engineering thrown in there as well. What I want you to listen and look for in this 5-minute clip are 3 things. What content knowledge is being taught? Number 1, content matters. Number 2, what skills are being taught? Skills matter more. And number 3, how are students being motivated to do their best work? Because motivation matters most. So let's see that short video, and then I'm going to come back and look forward to questions and conversation.
The philosophy of High Tech High is founded largely on the idea of kids making, doing, building, shaping, and inventing stuff. The engineers that I know, the architects I know, the artists I know, the great educators that I know, the entrepreneurs that I know, are all sort of perplexed and curious about how they can do it better the next time. And that type of perplexity leads to engagement. It leads to learning. It leads to innovation. We are trying to have that type of perplexity and curiosity get inculcated in our students in everyday practices.
In both Linkabit and Qualcomm, one of our problems was being able to hire enough qualified people, enough trained people. And so it was kind of a long-term view to set up High Tech High.
Oh, I don't think it's the glue work. I think I know. And
like if you have two spacing and 0.01, the gears will connect to that.
We didn't know that it was all going to work until maybe 4 weeks before exhibition,
Yeah.
3 weeks.
I mean, we knew that pieces of it were working, right? And even those pieces were impressive.
We had to learn about civilizations, the Mayans, the Romans, and the Greeks. And Scott and Mike didn't want to just teach us this. So they came up with this big wheel, which is a big gear, which has a lot of drawings on it, and is connected to all these other mechanisms, and they each represented our theory. So I learned about the Mayans, the Greeks, and the Romans, and I really based my theory off of the Romans.
And why so?
Because it has to do with expanding. They were always expanding, and what I realized is that they were expanding not because not just for the fun of it, but they needed resources for all the people back home, in Italy and all the ones that they, all the new places that they took over.
Then they had to, on their own, develop and defend an idea on why they think civilizations rise and fall.
So we had to create like a flow chart just explaining what our theory was, and then we got critiques on it, and then we created a group one.
Another piece is on the mechanical side. They need to take what's already an abstract concept with their theory, and they have to take that and actually physically manifest it. They have some very preliminary metrics they need to use. They know that there's going to be a big wheel turning at a certain RPM. They know how many teeth that is, so they have basically a box to work within, some bounds to work within, and they have to make everything.
Yeah, I can get it.
I put the wrong side in. Oh my god.
So we have an exhibition that we're preparing for right now, and it'll be tomorrow night, and there will be thousands of people here looking at student work, students presenting their work, visitors looking at the work, students presenting their work to each other. And I think that idea of making work public, that's a missing piece to me in schools in general.
For most of you, this is probably the biggest project that you've ever exhibited. A lot of you, it's the first project that you've ever really had a public exhibition of. All right? Cool. We're going to be here. If you need to go, we understand, but we're going to keep working for a few hours. Break.
This idea of sort of making something and having a public exhibition and having people come look at it. And you have that feeling that we all have, like, how did they do that?
You really need to understand it, and you really need to understand why you need to know this to be able to complete the project.
What astounded me was that while doing research, my theory, it actually fit with a lot of these civilizations. It wasn't just like some random theory.
When kids have that feeling, it's transformative for them. I made this, and everyone's coming to look at it.
I think we should get started. I want to welcome you all on Zoom and on YouTube. And I want to especially extend a hearty welcome to Tony. Tony, so great to see you again. Tony and I were musing that we haven't seen each other in person in a long while, actually a little bit longer than just the pandemic. So we're in need of catching up. I was truly excited watching your talk. So Tony is Senior Research Fellow at the Learning Policy Institute, and he's held positions at Harvard as a high school teacher, K-8 principal. Really, you've sort of had a role in the entire educational spectrum from kindergarten to graduate school. Tony's a sought-after speaker and has authored a number of books on the subject of education and innovation. I have one of them right here, Tony. I just don't want to get up and grab it to show it. You have to believe me. So we're really, really excited to have you here for a discussion on the subject of really inspiring our students to learn, because that, I think, is what the essence is of your message. And as you point out in your talk, it's sort of a sad fact that we take the inspiration that we're all born with, the motivation that we're all born with to learn, and most of our educational approaches beat it out of us. And it's certainly something that's perpetuated very much even in higher education. And I've tried to change that. Just last night, I had a student in my class who came from a lot of very traditional STEM courses who you know, after literally 2 weeks in my course, said, it's crazy because I've never taken a class at Harvard like this before. It really requires a deeper level of understanding, and it's challenging, but I feel like I've learned more in the first 3 weeks of this class than I did an entire semester before. But of course, not all of our students look at it that way. They'd rather, you know, use the what they call cram and flush method. Anyway, so to the audience, you know, if you've been before to these talks, if you have a question, you can put in the chat or you can raise your hand, and then I'll give you the floor. I'll start with some questions that I have on my mind, but I don't want to dominate the floor with my questions. So get in line by raising your hand or putting a question in the chat. So Tony, I found it particularly heartening that you were, that in a sense you admonished NEASC, an audience, as I told you, that I addressed a few years ago myself, to ignore test scores. And, you know, I've been hammering on the need to change our assessment practices. And I really hope that we can find a way to move away from mostly meaningless numerical metrics to rate our students. I mean, you mentioned somewhere in your talk, evidence-based, I think, versus data-driven, or maybe it would be better to say meaningless data-driven, data that don't really correlate with what really care. So how do we get there? What do we need to do? And if you stop to think about it, you know, you mentioned in your talk at some point Montessori. I am a product of Montessori school. Yeah. And you know, in some sense, Maria Montessori was just way ahead of her time. I mean, you read some of her writings and you wonder, how can it be that, what is it, 100 years ago or over 100 years ago, these ideas were so wonderfully clearly articulated, and here we're in the 21st century, and with mainstream education, we haven't gotten anywhere. Why is change so difficult? What can we do to actually make a dent in the current approach to education?
Well, first of all, I want to say how great it is to be with you and your audience. It has been a while since we've connected, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And also, I have to start with a disclaimer. I have never taught science, and most of my science courses for me were drudgery. In addition to some of the books I've written about education, I wrote a memoir about my own learning experiences. And until I discovered ecology, which is, of course, by nature interdisciplinary, I had no time for science. You know, I didn't understand why we were memorizing the periodic table and on and on. So that's the context with which I sort of begin this conversation. But I hope to learn as much about how best to teach science in this conversation as I have it already from you, Eric, and look forward to the same from others. But to your question, why is it so hard? Short answer is, I don't know. I mean, I have some hypotheses, some thoughts. Our education system has been a system of mass production. It's a factory model. It was born in the industrial era to solve an industrial problem. How do you batch process large numbers of immigrants or kids off the farms and give them very basic skills? And the skills we gave them, you know, our percentages of high school graduates, for example, increased substantially through the 20th century and into the 70s, and served the industrial economy pretty well. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we were economic leaders of the industrial economy. or the industrial era, because we had actually done a better job of educating kids for the industrial era. But the problem is that's the only education system we know. Nobody remembers that, in fact, prior to that, we had a one-room schoolhouse, and we had to, as we moved from an agrarian era to the industrial era, we had to move from one-room schoolhouses to factory model schools. Education systems have to evolve, and ours hasn't. And I think it's in part because the people who make decisions were good at the game of school. It worked for them. So, and it's all they know. People want kids to go to the schools they went to or the ones they wish they'd gone to. And so the big challenge, I think, is to nurture educational R&D. There is no innovation without research and development. There's no R&D in education, except for extraordinary people like yourself. We need many more people like you, Eric, and like the people on this video today to really do the educational R&D, to get the word out there, as you have, Eric, so successfully. But we need to invest institutionally in R&D. What's Harvard's educational R&D budget? It's often not happening at the ed school, I can promise you. I spent a lot of time there. So if it's not happening at the ed school, where else is it happening? And in terms of school districts and colleges, the challenge, I think, is first to frame the problem. We no longer live in the industrial era, that's obvious. We no longer, in fact, live in the knowledge economy. Peter Drucker coined that term 52 years ago. We live in the innovation era, and we have to evolve an education system that prepares all students for work, for learning, and for citizenship in a completely new era. Once we frame that as the key problem, then investments in R&D and creating model classrooms and model schools can move forward, I think, much more aggressively. But so far, we haven't even framed the problem. Einstein once said the formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution. Leadership around this country has not framed the education problem as anything other than inequity. Yes, inequity is a huge problem, but our current strategies are going to leave all of our kids behind, not just some of them.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, and you come back to that over and over in your talk, that the way we assess our students, the way we assess education, we usually try to quantify that in ways that may be readily quantified. But if you stop to think about it, the things that can be readily quantified are things like getting the right answer, or remembering something correctly, or manipulating members by rote, not necessarily asking the right questions, which is much more subjective, let alone being creative or innovative, which is truly hard to evaluate. So I think that assessment, not only of our students, but of even the performance of the entire educational system, is maybe partially responsible for preventing change. You mentioned somewhere in the middle of your talk that we stigmatize the F word, failure. Failure is essential to innovation. The road to innovation is littered with failure. But it's again the assessment that stigmatizes failure. And as long as we're attached to quantitative metrics, it's going to be really difficult to promote failure. So maybe, I love that you're part of the Mastery Transcript Consortium. I knew about it. I've looked at it. I visited one of the founding schools of the MTC Consortium, and the students I encountered at that school were some of the most impressive students I've ever seen, because they're freed from the tyranny of having to please the teacher and get the right answer to get the right grade. Yet these ideas, again, are very hard to implement. I don't know how many of the schools on the MTC consortium, for example, are public schools.
About 2/3, but many who are public are also charter schools and comparatively new startups. So that number is a little bit misleading, I think.
Okay, I see. Good. Let's see. I see Joe in the chat is saying, I think it's interesting that you seem to think minds will be changed by data and reframing, when I suspect the real issue that they believe, what they believe, and how do you change belief by the very same process you described in High Tech High? What would you say to that, Tony?
I do think it's about beliefs. It's about what we have experienced and what we assume will be the right experiences for our kids based on our own experience. Our beliefs are based on experience as well as convention. And that's why models like High Tech High, I think, are so important. Let me be clear. I don't think High Tech High is the only way to do things. There are lots of really great models out there. And as you mentioned, Eric, many are now members in the Mastery Transcript Consortium, and they have different approaches. And some emphasize more content than others. But the point is that until we have more existence proofs like High Tech High, it will be very hard to challenge beliefs and conventional wisdom, for the simple reason that people are afraid of the unknown for understandable reasons. Education is not a risk-taking profession. It's not like, venture capital. It's the exact opposite. We're a very conservative and conserving institution. And those that support education really don't have an investment, have a need to create something different. So the challenge, I think, is in leadership, is to help people to challenge their beliefs by helping them understand all of the ways in which our kids today are ill-prepared. And that's one reason why I think you begin this conversation with talking to recent graduates, as you've done, Eric, or in your case, you assess them to discover that, in fact, they really weren't learning any of the things that you thought you taught so well. That was the beginning of your journey. So if we start with talking to our recent graduates and asking them, and by recent, I mean 3 to 5 years out of high school at least, ask them in what ways they were most and least well prepared. What are the challenges they're facing today? What advice would they have for teachers? What advice would they have for parents? And videotape those focus groups and bring them back to your school. I've done this with a number of groups, and the effect can be transformative because so many people in education want to do the right thing for kids, and they believe they are doing the right thing, as you did, Eric, before you actually found out the bitter truth. So when young people tell us all of the ways in which they've been poorly prepared, or things they wish that school has spent more time on, it begins to be a different conversation. It's hard for me to challenge other adults' beliefs about education. It's one set of beliefs versus another. But with young people in the conversation and employers in the conversation saying, here are the skills that matter most, and here are the ways in which the kids are least well prepared, you can change beliefs, you can change minds. I work with a very large school district, 80,000 kids, who did a strategic planning process over the course of a year. And one of the things they did was interview employers, interview recent grads in focus groups, videotape those, and bring those back. And there was a 1,000-person conversation in a civic auditorium asking the citizens, once they've seen this evidence and the data about numbers of kids who leave college because they don't have the skills and so on, because that is a piece of important kind of evidence.
Absolutely.
They then decided on the highest priorities for their school district. And it was learning to think critically and learning how to learn on your own. And once the community had spoken, those priorities were maintained and were the seeds for the kind of continuing R&D and evolution that that district then enjoyed.
Thank you. Let's see, Marie Mortimer has her hand up. Please introduce yourself for the benefit of everybody and ask your question.
So I'm Elmarie Mortimer. I teach AP Physics here in Winter Park, Florida. And I want to start out by saying, Tony, when I came from industry and a research career into education. And so when I realized I'm going to teach high school physics, I bought 2 books. The first one was How to Teach Like a Pirate, which was relatively easy to implement. The other one was your book about how to teach innovators. And I'm 6 years into this journey and I'm still struggling to get those how to teach innovators and those concepts implemented in school, in my school. And I'm at the independent school. I've got a specific question, maybe more a discussion than a real answer, but one of the things that you said is, and we saw that in the video of the movie of High Tech High, is where the teachers are co-teaching. And I found that is one of the most difficult things to implement. Schools don't want co-teaching. They want, I guess it's from a financial point of view, where they want one teacher in a classroom. And if you say you want to put 2 teachers in a classroom, there's a whole bunch of reasons why it can't be done. So is there any way that one can work around the system to at least get that cooperation and let the students see that cooperation modeled without actually having 2 people standing in the classroom?
That's a great question, Marie, and thank you for the work you're continuing to do to try to solve this new equation. One quick thought that comes to my mind is that you partner with another teacher who's like-minded and see if you can jointly develop some lesson plans together, although you may teach them separately. So I'll give an easy example. I used to teach high school English. Now, if I were doing so today in the constraints that you've described, I'd try to go find a US history teacher who was like-minded. And we would, in effect, create an American Studies program. And his emphasis might be a little more in history, mine might be a little more in English. We're not teaching in the same classroom at the same time, but we would have jointly developed a curriculum that brought in the arts, that brought in music, that brought in many other aspects of American Studies that would have really enriched both courses, and try to teach concurrently in the sense of using the literature of a period of history to help illuminate that period of history. So that's one idea. I think it's probably harder in science. I don't have an easy model or example of that, but I'm sure perhaps some of the people who are listening today might.
So there's an interesting chat discussion going on in the chat, and I was typing a reply, but I think it's maybe better to bring it here on the floor. Helen Reynolds is asked a way back, you'd have to scroll back, it says, can one problem solve without knowledge of the domain within which the problem is set, or come up with creative solutions without knowledge of many domains? And I know that a lot of discussion education focus on content rather than skills. And the focus has been for close to 100 years, ever since the Committee of Nine formulated its report back in, 1911, 100 years ago or so, focused on content. And I think I tend to agree, you cannot swing all the way back to skills without any content. But I would love to hear your view. I mean, you mentioned at one point the siloing of knowledge, and I have to agree with you. The problems of the 21st century are not limited to a single discipline. And I think MIT is doing something really interesting with their new engineering education transformation, where they try to break these disciplinary boundaries and educate students to become problem solvers across disciplines rather than siloed into the content of a single discipline. So where would you lie the balance between content and skills? And I see that Helen has her hand up, so I'm going to cede the floor to her in case she wants to better articulate the question than I did. Here you go, Helen.
Hi, thank you. No, I just wanted to kind of throw out really that my understanding of my reading, especially the book that I put in the chat, the How Learning Happens book and all the cognitive science stuff, is that really the delineation between knowledge and skills is not particularly useful, because in a sense a skill is a type of knowledge. It's a procedural knowledge as opposed to a declarative knowledge. So we have what we learn to say that we're going to answer multiple choice tests, which is declarative knowledge, and then there's the, if I want to work out how fast the wind is blowing before it knocks me over, as I did with my AP class this week, what kind of skills do I bring to that? But it's actually the fact that my problem space is much bigger because I've investigated a lot more problems. I have that knowledge, in a sense, of those things that you do in order to solve problems. And I'm a very good problem solver because I do physics and I do a bit of history and I do a bit of this. And each of those things is a bit of knowledge that I bring to the party. So I'm concerned a little bit about teaching skills, because I really, from my understanding, don't think you can teach people to think critically just as a thing independent of the stuff around. So that was all I wanted to clarify. Thank you. Very interesting, by the way. I'm very much enjoying this.
Well, Helen, first of all, I loved your distinction between sort of knowledge that is a skill versus knowledge that is not applied. Tell me again, procedural versus what? I missed it.
Declarative. It was declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge.
Yeah, so I think that's incredibly interesting and important. I've been caught up in this skills versus knowledge controversy since I wrote my first well-known book, The Global Achievement Gap, about 15 years ago. And I was seen as only a skills guy. And I think that's unfortunate. I try to make clear in the presentation that I gave that content knowledge matters. It matters that we know where we've come from, what human beings have accomplished, not just in history, but in science and math. That as you say, Helen, you can't teach critically without rich and challenging content being a part of the conversation. So the challenge, I think, is within the context of these broad disciplines of science and math, deciding what content knowledge matters most and how and when it should be taught. Not whether or not it should be taught, but what should be taught. I mean, do we still really require kids to memorize the periodic table? And especially when new elements are being discovered constantly? Oh, and how many planets are there? You know, is Pluto in or out of the club this week? I read something last week that was, you know, a little questionable. So so much of the content that we teach is forgotten the minute the test is over. Eric and others have proven that. Number one, why? Because it's not applied. It's not needed. It's not useful. And secondly, it's content knowledge whose expiration date may be much sooner than we actually think and understand. So yes, the content. But, you know, to be honest, I'd rather see ecology. I mean, here I'm probably saying something heretical now. I'd rather see ecology be the required science of high school. Ecology, which integrates biology and physics and chemistry. Ecology, which is about the survival of the planet and the species, and has a built-in urgency to it, as well as a built-in interdisciplinary spirit. So I would be inclined to start there. You know, how do we integrate the essential content knowledge and frame it with some sense of, number one, how it's applied, and number two, why it's important? You know, the old jingle is, we teach content knowledge just in case in most schools today, whereas in fact, it should be taught just in time when kids really need it. Now, you can't do that. That's an oversimplification. But I think if we move more in the direction of, give kids a problem that requires content knowledge to solve. And then I think we'll be beginning to move in the right direction.
If you were appointed, this makes me think. I'm going to pose a hypothetical question here. If you were appointed to a new committee of 9, how would you structure education in the 21st century?
That's an incredibly challenging question, and I can only really just give you a first principle. And it's the basis of the book I'm working on now with 2 colleagues, Laura Christensen and Sujata Bhatt. Let's go back. If we could see a show of hands, I'd be curious to know how many of you are familiar with scouting, or either a Boy Scout, Girl Scout, Eagle Scout, whatever. Raise your hands. That's an education system that's based on proficiency or mastery. How do you get a camping badge? Well, you have to take some content knowledge requirements. You've got to know first aid. You've got to know navigation, how to read a map, how to use GPS now. And then you got to go know something about nutrition, because you're going to lead a trip. That's a requirement for a Boy Scout camping badge, that you lead a trip. And then you have to do a conservation project in your community. So and how is that assessed? Evidence-based and collective human judgment. That's how it's assessed, those different proficiencies. Obviously, some of it is quantitative. Did you pass the first aid test? But you don't get one shot at that first aid test. It's not all or nothing. It's like a driver's test. You keep working at it until you pass it. So I think that the concept of mastery or proficiency should be the unit of education, not time. What is a high school diploma today or a college diploma today? It is a certificate of seat time served. I've served my credit hours. I've served my Carnegie units, my 200 hours. It's not a certificate of anything, of mastery of anything. What if we did, flying commercial pilot license like that? Okay, I've served my time in the classroom. I've studied physics. I understand the regulations, FAA, blah, blah, blah. But, I don't really know how to fly. Oh, wait, yes, I did take the flying test and I got a C+. I'm pretty good at takeoffs, but I haven't figured out the landing thing. No, the adult world demands proficiency, competency, even mastery. And there are only, as I've mentioned in my talk, there are only 3 grades that matter: A, B, or incomplete. The F is the failure not to show up, not to try. So what if we moved the entire system to mastery? That a high school diploma would be a certificate of initial mastery, that a middle school and K-5 experience would be sort of backwards mapped from that certificate of mastery. And the certificate of mastery would have some requirements. We have to demonstrate a working knowledge of the scientific method, develop a hypothesis, design an experiment to test the hypothesis, and present your findings and defend them to a panel. This is not hypothetical. I've seen science taught that way by a teacher at Georgetown Day School, entire course. 2 weeks on the on how do you develop a experiment and a hypothesis, and the whole rest of the semester was students developing, testing their hypotheses. Excuse me. So what if a high school diploma were a collection of proficiencies? The history proficiency would be that you can demonstrate the ability to look at multiple perspectives, analyzing primary documents at a particular moment in history. The communications merit badge is an obvious one, that you have to demonstrate proficiency in a range of communication media as well as in listening. So I'm using these illustratively as an example. But then there would also be elective merit badges, right? Entrepreneurship, service, or maybe we make service a required badge. And how would we assess students' work? Through a digital portfolio that follows students through school, and regular requirements where students have to present and defend their work, as we saw at High Tech High. And it would be, again, a group of human beings, collective human judgment informed by a variety of evidence that would determine, in fact, whether or not a student has achieved mastery, much like a PhD defense. I think that's what a high school's graduation should look like, a PhD dissertation defense. And in college and various iterations, technical school, community college can be ways of developing specialized badges or more advanced badges. So let me stop at that point and give people a chance to react and disagree, because I think it's a great question. I'd love to know what other people think.
Absolutely. And Megan Bartley has had her hand up patiently for a while. So Megan.
Well, I could not agree more with everything you're saying, and I watched your chat as well before. You know, I'm a high school teacher. I've taught actually in independent schools in Los Angeles, pretty close to High Tech High, and met people there involved with High Tech High, met some of the teachers there. And now I'm back in the Midwest and a rural-ish area, which is a little more conservative in terms of keeping the good old way is the best way. But I'm one of those teachers that pushes on the envelope a little bit in my classroom, and I do that with grading. And I have a mastery system set up with opportunities for multiple reassessment. But the reality is that I'm still locked into putting those numbers into that computer and then that pumping out a letter, in which parents are very, very concerned about for a variety of reasons, whether it's because they want to go to Michigan or because they just, you know, there's some kind of, you know, freedom at home tied to that on the weekends. And so I'd love to be like a lab classroom, you know, even if it was one class, 1 hour a day, where, you know, everybody knew coming in that, you know, this is going to be graded differently, not graded. And I'm wondering if you have any examples, because I've been following the Mastery Transcript Consortium for a long time and talking to people about it. And people seem kind of like, oh, that's such a cool idea, but it's, you know, over there, it's out in that California place. And so the idea is that do you have any examples of, like, I look at the consortium's page in the transcript itself, and I think about, like, how could I develop something that would be maybe passable in the environment and still kind of, is there any way to make the parents, like, say, yeah, Michigan, I mean, I looked at the, you know, Michigan State is taking the transcript. Like, how can we as individual teachers kind of be like that example of, like, here's how you could do it. And then we would also maybe have that data from the kids, hopefully, that would say, yeah, because I ask my kids often, hey, do you think if we stopped grading you, you'd learn more or less? And they immediately say less. And then I give them some wait time and they're like, oh, wait, no, like, I think more. And then they discuss that. And it's interesting to watch their reactions. So I just wonder if you have any examples of that or any thoughts of pointing us in the right direction for us, you know, teachers who are ready to push that boundary a little bit.
Well, first of all, I think we desperately need more examples of that. And I don't have a lot at my fingertips now, which is the reason why I'm researching and writing this new book, to precisely answer that question. But one quick thought is that, and I'm sure you've probably already tried this, you could take a portion of your class, say the last 3 weeks, and I've seen this done in AP classes. AP, I'll give an example. In fact, it was in Oklahoma, I think, or someplace unexpected. An independent school teacher of an AP science class, I don't remember which one. Obviously, she finishes early because AP tests are in May. And so the next 3 weeks, she says, okay, you as a class are going to team up. You're going to develop a hypothesis, design an experiment, test it, and then you're going to do poster presentations of your final project. And this was required, but it was credit, no credit, not even pass fail, credit, no credit. And so there may be a way in which you can say, okay, this content part of the class is, you know, graded conventionally, but here's another one where you get extra credit, or however you want to describe it. But I went to that poster presentation. I will never forget it. There were two young women who developed a hypothesis that Tables at fast food restaurants would be less clean, i.e. have more bacteria. So they went around getting samples from different kinds of tables at different kinds of restaurants, sent them out to be analyzed. Lo and behold, they were wrong. They were pretty much just as clean as the high-end restaurants. But the whole point is they were doing science. And the kids understood it. And when they made that the very public day of presentations, you didn't have to persuade a lot of people of the value of that. The kids showed it in their excitement and in their competence. So I'm wondering if there's a way you can sort of modify your class to make the last 3 weeks, the last month, or a day a week, something where kids are working on a project where they have to apply what they've learned and they get some kind of differential credit for that.
Yeah, I always say to the kids kind of in that, if we get down that road a little bit, because they're puzzled by my grading system when they get a mastery score instead of a, how many out of 10. And that takes a while to shift. It takes at least a semester to even shift their thinking towards the idea of reassessment because they've never experienced it. And but then I say, how'd you guys get so, they love sports, we love sports up here. And I'm like, how'd you get so good at sports without grades? And they're like,
perfect.
So,
or drama or music, or
yeah,
pick one.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly.
The one thing I did learn as a high school teacher, and I wrote about this in my memoir, which is a memoir of all the ways in which I dropped out of high school once, dropped out of college twice, and spent a decade trying to become the teacher I wished I'd had, very influenced by my experiences in the civil rights movement. If you think this is a plug for my new book, Educating for Education, Learning by Heart, you're absolutely right. It is. But my point is this, that I learned early on that I could be a very different kind of teacher, provided I clearly explained to students and parents why. And Parents' Night, the first time I did it, I dreaded it. But I had a very clear explanation for what I was doing in my English classes that was different. I said, in this class, your students will learn 4 things. They'll learn to do research. They'll learn to read critically. They'll learn to write well in a variety of genres. I can't remember the 4th, but those were the 3 critical ones. And I said, my experiences at the university level, I didn't have to name drop Harvard because they already knew I had a master's from Harvard, is that these are the skills that matter most. And this is why I'm focusing on this with your kids. Never a question, never. Well, actually, there were a couple, but they were kind of fun and funny. The point being, though, that if we're really clear about our rationale and we provide some evidence about why this is important, I think we have a little more permission and leeway than we might think.
So, thank you for that question, Megan, because it made me think, and the Mastery Transcript Consortium is a consortium of schools, not of teachers. And I find myself much in the same position as you, namely as somebody who would like to adopt a mastery transcript in a school that requires grades at the end of the semester. And I became aware of this Mastery Transcript Consortium when I first visited the Nueva School in California, and I remember coming back and thinking, "This is what I need to do. I'll get my students motivated for learning again as soon as I give up a single numerical grade at the end of the semester." And I worked for half a year on a talk called "The Assessment, the Silent Killer of Learning." I should really have called it "Grades, the Silent Killer of Learning." And I gave it at Harvard, and the dean of the college who took me out to dinner said afterwards, "We have to eliminate grades." And here we are, I think it's 7 years later, and we still have grades. And so, I felt stuck. I did everything to sort of evaluate my students in a number of different dimensions. And then at the end, I had to collapse that into a meaningless metric, from a narrative evaluation to a quantitative, numerical, or actually alphabetical, but same as numerical ranking. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but during the pandemic, when I realized I had to make changes to the assessment when we went to remote teaching, for more changes than I'd done previously, I came across the idea of specifications grading, which is sort of a bridge between mastery grading and the old-fashioned grading approach. And there's an article in Inside Higher Ed with the title, "Yes, Virginia, there's a better approach to grading," that you may want to have a look at. And there's actually a whole Slack workspace. I can put the URL in the chat later, called Alternative Grading, that discusses a number of approaches that sort of, because going from where we are now to where we all collectively here, even though we may have different opinions, I think in general, we won't want to end up in the same place. And we want to end up in this utopian world where students learn through intrinsic motivation. But we can't get there in one step. And the specification gradings might well be, for individual teachers, a step in the right direction. So I'll put, as soon as I have a moment free, I'll put the URLs in the chat. Sorry, I've taken too much time here. Joe, you've had your hand up patiently, so I'll cede the floor to you.
Thanks, Eric. Let me just remind folks, I'm a retired college physics teacher, but for the past 20 years, I've been working to help elementary school teachers do a better job of understanding what science is so that they can teach science better. And in that process, I've also been a consultant on a project to try to change what goes on in elementary schools. But first, a comment to Megan. A colleague of mine who works in mathematics recommends that teachers try to do 1 week's worth of learning in 4 days, and then use the last day, Friday, as an open-ended sort of day in which students can use the content that they've learned in the previous week in a skill situation, or they can, in a skill situation, begin to look at what they're going to be learning next week. So Friday becomes a transition day in which the focus is on process and skills used for either old knowledge or developing new knowledge. So that's a model that works in mathematics, and in fact I've suggested it to science teachers, and it works there as well. Now, Tony, what I want to ask you about is precisely what Eric was talking about, bridge. You wave a flag very strongly for what you want, and then that's because you're an idealist. I'm a pragmatist. I've spent the last 10, 15 years trying to do systematic change in elementary schools teaching science in the state of Indiana. What we have settled on is some sort of science teaching kit that is highly structured so that teachers are able to engage students in doing science. But my claim all along is that this is not the best thing to do, but it is the best thing that the average teacher can do to help the average student learn science. So what I'm asking you to do is to let go for the moment of your ideal view of high-tech high school, and we can have a long conversation about that one, okay? And ask you, what do you think the practical bridge is right now, considering that you have to take into account teacher skills, teacher beliefs, what's going on in teacher education programs, what's going on with legislatures thinking about state standards, the whole ball of wax. It's a Gordian knot. What's a good bridge?
Well, first of all, I applaud what you're doing with elementary teachers, Joseph. That's incredible. And again, I don't have any easy answers. I think the idea of encouraging individual teachers to take small steps. My colleague Ted Dintersmith, with whom I wrote the book and the movie Most Likely to Succeed, has a great website called What School Could Be. And he has all kinds of short videos describing small ways in which people can do something different in a very conventional classroom. And they now have a kind of a network of individual teachers who are constantly sharing ideas. whatschoolcouldbe.org, and occasional speakers and so on. So there's a lot of good resources there from a variety of teachers, and good videos on authentic assessment, on project-based learning, things of that sort. You know, I would, the simple thing, utterly simple, would be to give every teacher a basic kind of in-service program, as you're doing, on the idea of doing a project at the end of every semester, or 1 day a week. This would be another great way to do it. I've seen it done both ways. But I think that the necessary preparation, as I believe I mentioned in my talk, is the idea of students keeping a question journal or an idea journal, where they're periodically writing down questions that occur to them or concerns they have about what's going on in the world. You know, maybe a high school student today might say, well, why would Russia want to invade Ukraine? What's in it for them? And that, of course, that leads to a whole question about history in the Soviet Union and so on. But my point is, if we have students do this, and there's a simple discipline, you know, 3 weeks before the end of the semester, you're going to do a credit, no credit project, and no credit will affect your grade adversely. Credit, I don't know, you can structure it a lot of ways. But the idea is that students circle the question or concern that they have. It's been kind of at them for a while, as you talk with them individually and coach them, and then give them time to explore that. That muscle, as I've mentioned in my talk, I deeply believe curiosity is a muscle. We're born with it, but it withers without exercise. And school, I think, undermines the development and strengthening of curiosity. So that's the first thing that I think could be a bridge in virtually every single classroom, in every single subject, in every single grade. I don't see a reason why not. In fact, I've seen it happen. So to those of you who are developing kind of professional development programs as you are, Joseph, I think that's just absolutely wonderful and the right step forward.
I wonder what the group thinks about this question. And that is, do they think that in general, teachers are prepared to do what you're suggesting? Just
No, I don't think
that one step.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, you know, our teacher preparation programs are a disaster. I got a Master's of Arts in Teaching at Harvard. I didn't learn to teach at Harvard. It took me 5 years to figure it out. My so-called internship with a master teacher was anything but. You know, he was not a master teacher, and I didn't learn anything from it, as I chronicle in my memoir. But so the point is, short of transforming teacher preparation, which hasn't happened yet, the idea of brief in-services that school districts can afford to do. They have the money to do that now because of the grants that are pouring into schools post-COVID. They have the money to do these kinds of professional development programs. So there's no reason why they can't develop teachers' capabilities to take this simple, straightforward step into the future.
Wow, it's always at the end that all of a sudden the questions come up. And I wanted to also broach the whole subject of not just team teaching, but team-based learning, right? I mean, preparing students for a society that depends on people working with each other rather than on individuals who are trained alone. But I see both Julene and Robert who have questions. So I'm gonna ask them to each ask their question in rapid succession. And then I'm gonna give you the floor, Tony, for your closing remarks. So let's go with Julene first.
I just wanted to respond a little bit. So I work in a low-income district, mostly. Well, my students are mostly low income, and all the districts around us love mastery-based learning. Like, they're definitely on board. They think this is great, but then the implementation has become we're retaking the multiple choice test until we get all the answers right. And I think it's because teachers want to do it, but we don't have the tools and we don't have the time at all. Like, we don't get any extra time to do this. I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for small things, and also how you convince administrators that we haven't solved the problem because we've said we've done mastery-based learning.
Yeah.
So before you answer, Tony, let's have Robert also ask his question, and then you'll have the floor uninterrupted. Robert.
So funny that you asked that, Jolene. That's exactly what I was thinking. The only part that I want to add, it's a very similar question, is the idea of merit badges, or this kind of checking off the standards through the acknowledgement of others instead of maybe just the teacher, the community. Same deal. Where do you think is the start if you had to do a start?
Mm-hmm. Well, two great questions. The whole hour has been filled with incredibly good questions, so I commend all of you. To the question of mastery, I agree with you, Jolene, that people are kind of misconstruing it as the idea of, all right, just keep taking the test till you pass the damn thing. I think you start with defining what does it mean to be a high school graduate? What are the core competencies? And mastery has to be seen in that context of creation of a profile of a graduate. And so when students are taking these tests over and over, the first question to ask is, what are they learning? What is the largest competence or content knowledge that they're mastering by retaking this multiple choice test? Why is this knowledge important? How do we know? Who said so? So I think that's the first part, that mastery has to be tied to a larger vision of what does it mean to be a high school graduate. Again, a high school diploma as a certificate of mastery. And then you backwards map from there. And my colleague, Ulrich Christensen, area9lyceum.com, is developing a whole very robust software platform that will help teachers do all of this work in their courses. And so, sneak preview of coming attractions, go to area9lyceum.com and learn about Rhapsode, because it's in the development phases now, very closely tied to MTC, and I think will be an absolutely essential tool for both individual teachers and school districts. And I think he may be looking for people to help him with the R&D to try things out.
What's that URL? I'm sorry.
I think it's area9lyceum.org.com. .com. area9lyceum.com. Or Google Ulrich Christensen.
Yeah. It's in the chat already.
Yeah, okay.
Great.
Yeah. So to the question of community, it's a really important question. I think if we define core competencies, we understand that schooling doesn't have to happen, 7 hours a day in these confined walls. It's 24/7 out in the community. It's internships, it's service learning, and engaging the community as elders, as mentors, as coaches in very specific ways is absolutely essential. And we ought to sort of start with that. The art of kind of supporting young people in their growth as they develop core competency is a community responsibility. It can't just happen 7 hours a day within these cinder block walls for 9 months of the year. So final words, thank you. Thank all of you for the incredibly important work that you're doing. You're asking really important questions. And obviously, I don't have answers. Like you, I'm still a searcher. I'm still trying to learn. But I think you're providing models of new kinds of learning, new ways of inquiring about the purpose of education, new forms of assessments that are absolutely essential to the future of learning, and indeed, I think, to the future of our society. Because unless we differently prepare our kids for the future, I'm not sure we're going to have a future. There's urgent work to be done, urgent problems to be solved, as everyone here knows. So thank you very much for your time, your attention, your questions, your commitment, your collegiality.
Well, Tony, we are the one thanking you. So a major round of real and virtual applause for your words of wisdom. In the chat, Megan is writing, thank you so much for promoting authentic teaching and learning. And I think that was the true message of your talk. One very last quick thing in the 30 seconds that we've left is, and we can do this asynchronously, we don't need to do it now. Megan is saying, because I think change might be more within reach when there were external pressures on the system. So having access to employers and people who are encouraging change and being able to present that to parents, teachers, politicians, journalists, I think is very important. So maybe we should set up a library of resources that we can use to help spread that message. So I'll connect asynchronously with you to find out where we can access it.
I look forward to that. I totally agree with you, by the way. We desperately need them as allies. We have to stop distrusting the motives of every business person. They are essential allies.
Yeah, and another problem in education is, that there's very much the not invented here syndrome. If we were like the car lobby, we even with competitors, we all lobby for the same thing. But in education, it tends to be, well, if you don't do exactly what I'm doing, I don't talk to you. And we have to get past that and join hands and move this huge mountain ahead of us. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Tony. I really can't thank you enough for this wonderful contribution. We have another talk coming up. I had it in front of me on the screen and now I misplaced it. Let's see, that's our next speaker in March, who will be Julie Jungawala from Harvard University and the Institute for the Future of Learning. And the title of her talk will be Building and Leading a Modern School, the 3 Truths and 5 Decisions of Our Time. This talk will be on March the 12th. So I look forward to seeing all of you then again. And thank you so much, Tony. I look forward to reconnecting in person or maybe on Zoom, depending on how the situation is, very soon. Goodbye.
I do as well. Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everyone. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.